On strategy, this is for AF. Grace is gonna go over neg. I think for both sides, but especially for the AF side, it's important to think about the round backwards. At least when it comes to round strategy. When I when I start writing my AF, which is like the basis of your strategy as the affirmative team, right? Like all of your strategy is based around what you start off the round with. The way that I write my AFs is based on what I want to have in the last speech. My 2AR is like half of it is written by the time I get there. That's not to say that like written word for word, but like what I want to be saying. So when I get to the 2AR, I know that the things that I want to have in it are one of my impacts, the advantage that got to that impact, and then whatever the negative said. And so that's the point where I take like this impact, this advantage, and then I can start writing that into the 1AC. So for the app that the Will and I are running right now, um, I didn't create the app based on like just evidence I found. Besides the fact that I found the general topic of like the IRS, I found that that was a possible app area. But then from there, I didn't just start like looking for um like any random piece of information that might turn into an advantage, right? I saw, oh, this is about tax evasion. Let's look at some plausible impacts. Which of these do I want to run? And then from there, I worked backwards into advantages. And the reason why I'm saying this is because like the round, your strategy as an affirmative team is all starting from the moment you write your 1AC. Whatever you have in your 1AC determines what your round strategy is going to be. If you're reading a big stick AF, then it's going to be to go hard on one of those impacts. It's going to be to do impact calc in the 1AR and in the 2AR and hope that your impact is bigger and more probable than the next. If you're running a smaller AF, like what most teams are running this year, then your strategy is going to just be to try to win solvency. Most likely, you're going to need to answer a counter plan. So these are like all important things that you have to start thinking about from the very start. And so then the second thing in writing a 1AC and in starting your round strategy is what the negative is going to run. Um, so I can immediately say from my AF or from mandatory minimums or any AF, before I've ever seen a negative strategy for it, I can give a pretty good guess as to what most neg strats are going to look like. Um, for our AF, there are like budget arguments, there's stuff like that. There's enforcement, there's topicality. There are certain counter plans that you could run that are generics. There's politics disads. All of this stuff is things that I need to prepare for as the affirmative team. And so the strategy comes in with saying, how can I write my AF to be prepared so that the only things I'm going to need to answer are things I'm ready to answer? When I'm looking into my 2AR, what I want to see is, am I more comfortable answering a disad than a counterplan? If so, let's write an AF that's really hard to write a counterplan against, but maybe there are more disadvantages. And so you can start to shape the round before the round's ever started just by these decisions of how you write your AF. Now, moving beyond that, there's a lot more that you can get into with writing your AF and with what decisions you want to make. But I want to get more into how the decisions will go throughout the round. So from the 1AC, there's not really much besides how you write it. But writing it is very important because after all, it's like what 90% of your evidence in the round, 90% of your arguments are going to come from. Other stuff is just going to be to support it. Your AF is your win condition. It's the most important part of the round for you as the affirmative team. Um, so now the biggest decision comes with the 2AC. And this comes in multiple forms. So one, there's time allocation. What most people, and this is what I've always been told, like to do is you want to split the time in the 2AC half and half. You want 4 minutes for on case and 4 minutes for off case. Now it is fine. Like, this is not a 100% time rule, because there are times where the neg team will not read a single argument on case and then will only read off case. And in that situation, it's fine to only spend a minute and a half on your case and then spend the rest off case. And likewise, if they read one really short disad and then they read a bunch of on case arguments, it's fine to not spend 4 minutes answering a single disad. So you have to make this decision for yourself every round, but assuming that their coverage is pretty even or even is slightly skewed towards off case, a 4-to-4 balance is generally pretty good. And the reason being is that even if they read more off case, you want to spend more time on your own arguments. Because again, getting to the 2AR, the most important thing isn't that you've answered all of the neg arguments, it's that you still have at least one advantage. You want to get to the 2AR with an advantage completely intact. And so it's more important that you keep that going. You spend more time on your own advantages than it is that you answer the neg arguments. So then the other important decisions to make in the 2AC come mainly from what arguments you're going to make. So if you're reading mandatory minimums and they read a politics disad and a states counterplan, you have to immediately think about what you want to read that is going to work well into that for your interests. So it's about reading specific arguments that aren't going to contradict your own, but you think are going to be effective in answering the neg arguments. Um, and a lot of this is just dependent on like what the neg arguments are. But I think the important thing is, again, to remember that these are the arguments that you are going to end up making in the 2AR, or the arguments in the 2AR are going to be very, very closely tied to it. So you should not read a single card in the entire round that you would not want to repeat in the 2AR. If you read a card that says something that you don't think is important enough to go into the 2AR, if that argument still matters, there's no point in reading that card whatsoever, right? So like if they read a counterplan and then you read really good evidence and then they kick the counterplan, that's fine. That's not what I'm talking about. But if you read a piece of evidence that talks about your AF or the disad and it's vaguely related, but it isn't what you would bank your 2AR off of, then you shouldn't be reading it in the first place. Because at that point, it's just a waste of time. And now there are times, or you're not going to read every piece of evidence and then bring it all into the 2AR. But you should be confident with every piece of evidence that you read to bring it into the 2AR. So now there are a few other things that are important in the 2AR. The main things are that you have to answer everything in the one that was in the 1NC. Not so you have to answer everything off case with at least a few arguments. You have to answer everything on case, responding to every single argument they made. Because one argument is enough to take out an advantage. So you have to respond to every single answer on your AF, on your solvency. For their arguments, you can read as much as you want. If they read a disad, you can put 2 answers on it, or you could put 6. But it's important to at least read what, like, you should always have more than one. I'd say shoot for a minimum of 3, but if you can't scrape by to get to 3, then having 2 is fine. The worst case scenario, you have 1, you should absolutely never have 0. And this will set you up better for the future speeches. Now, this kind of gets me into the 1AR. Your idea going into the 1AR is never, never, never to say everything that you said in the 2AC. And this should already be obvious by the fact that it's 3 minutes shorter. So it's absolutely impossible to say everything that you said in the 2AC. And in addition to that, restating yourself isn't going to get you anywhere in the debate. So what you want to do is condense and then extrapolate based on the stuff that you've already read. So evidence that you read can then be taken in more ways and can be used to argue against the neg arguments. And that's especially important because you don't want to have to read new evidence in the 1AR. You want to be able to use the evidence in the 2AC in the 1AR. And that's why I'm saying that it's so important to have that good evidence start in the 2AC or even in the 1AC. You want to have all the evidence that you read in the 2AC be useful throughout the entire round. And if you don't have a reason to bring it into the 2 or into the 1AR, then there's no reason to be bringing it into the 2AC in the first place. Now, since the 1AR is super short, it also means that you have to condense a lot. Now, what this does not mean is that you should decrease the quality of your arguments. What it does mean is that you should decrease the quantity. And I've seen this a lot from people on our team, from people on other teams, from people at camp, from people like on the national circuit. It happens absolutely everywhere. And what that is people bringing 2 advantages into the 1AR. The people who bring 6 arguments on a disad into the 1AR. You don't have the time for that. And I've even had college debaters who won the national tournament who showed us examples of them making this exact mistake. And that problem is that the more you try to put into the 1AR, the less you're actually going to be able to say. So when they read a disad and they have a bunch of answers in the neg block, that's what's going to happen, and you have to accept that because they have 13 minutes and you have 5. So your objective is not to beat them on every single argument that you and they made. Your objective is to beat them on one. And this is really the pinpoint of AF strategy that I think most people miss in general, is that you don't have to win every argument you make, and you don't have to make sure that the neg doesn't win every argument you make. You only have to win the important ones. And one of the biggest skills in policy is being able to identify what the important ones are. And so um, the general importance is, first of all, your advantages are absolutely the most important. And so always put them at the top of the speech for this reason. And this is true for every speech. If you lose your advantages, you lose the round. So you always want to cover your advantages first. And on the advantages, you have to cover every single argument because one argument is enough to make you lose an advantage. Then you want to cover the neg defense, which is mainly counter plans. So after the advantages, then you get to counter plans. Counter plans, there are a few strategies you can take. And actually, Gabe, did you already give the counter plan lecture? You did, right?
Yep.
Okay. So yeah, with counter plans, Gabe's already talked about it, but the main strategies that you can carry into the 1AR and 2AR are a perm-based strategy, an offense-based strategy, or a theory-based strategy. I'd recommend one of the first two. So perm-based strategy is just do both. It works. There's no net benefit. Offense-based strategy is counterplan's bad. Or counterplan doesn't solve the F. Theory would be like the counterplan is illegitimate and we shouldn't be debating it, but most of the time that's not going to be true and you shouldn't be debating that anyway. Um, so you get to the counterplan, they should be right after your advantages, and then you have to make sure that you go into one of these. Do not do both. Because like I've been saying, you don't have to do both. There is going to be one of these options that's better. If it's a mutually exclusive counterplan, don't go for the perm because it's not going to work. Spend the time that you would have wasted saying perm do both instead talking about why the AF solves better than the counterplan. All of these times where you're making arguments that aren't useful or that you know are bad is time that you could be spending on the arguments that you can actually win the round off of. And so counterplans take second priority over your own offense, and you should again focus on one way that you can beat the counterplan. And then last, you should get to the negative offense. And when you get here, it's same thing as counterplans, just it's a different style of argument. Instead of perms or offense, you just have turns or defense. And you should only go in for one. If they have a really solid DA going into the 1AR, you aren't supposed to cover the impact, the internal link, the link, and the uniqueness. All you have to do is go for one. The internal link alone is enough that if you take it out, then it just destroys the entire disadvantage. And it's important to then also recognize if there are specific arguments that like an entire DA or an entire counter plan hinges on. If they're making this entire disadvantage uh, argument off of the idea that politicians are going to change how they act because of how the plan is passed, their entire argument hinges off of this somewhat questionable logic. And so at that point, that's like a good area to target. Because if they lose that, the rest of the disad doesn't matter. Now, likewise, if somebody reads a disad that all hinges on the fact that the current US Congress is going to solve climate change, well, then that's another really questionable argument that their entire disad hinges on. So when you get into the 1AR, your question should not be how do I answer everything? It's what do I answer? It's not about how you can answer everything to the best of your ability. It's about choosing the smallest things possible that you can take and still be able to take out the biggest arguments with it. So the way you get efficient 1ARs and the way that you get the most important arguments possible into the 2AR is by deciding what you want to go for, not like how you want to go for it or what you are going to do in order to be able to go for it. And by just being able to choose the few arguments you need to actually win, that's how you're going to realize that a 5-minute speech answering 13 isn't really that bad. Now, for the 2AR, most of it's just going to carry over from the 1AR. You want to plan the 1AR around what you want to be in the 2AR. So I'd recommend before the 1AR, always taking prep and having the 2A talk with the 1A about specific arguments that you want to be made. And this is important because if they aren't made, you can't have them in the 2AR. So it can get down like to the exact word. If the 2A wants a specific argument made that they made in the 1AC or in the 2AC, that you can say, feel free to say these exact words, this argument, blah, blah, blah. And by doing that, you can make sure that the 2A has exactly what they want in the 2AR. And from there, the 2AR is doing the same thing as the 1AR. You want to decide what you have to go for and then think about how you can do it. Because even in the 1AR, it's going to have more content than what's going to happen in the 2AR. The 2AR should have the least content of any speech in the entire round. You should not have 2 advantages in it. You should not have 5 answers to a disadvantage on it. You should have a few in-depth arguments that you are winning on, and that's your best chance of winning the round. If you have 2 advantages in your 2AR, unless both of them were completely untouched throughout the entire round, which will happen, and in that case, it's probably fine, you otherwise should not have 2 advantages. You like if you are, it just means that you're wasting time that you could be spending talking about one advantage. And even if they don't answer either advantage at all, it can oftentimes still be better to mention one, but then focus on the other and do the impact calc for the other. Now, the most important part of 2ARs is, and I'm going to get into this with a later lecture, but the most important part is impact calc. At the end of the round, you need to be telling the judge why they vote for what you are saying and why it's more important than the neg arguments. And your entire round is building up to this decision of why what you said is more important. And at that point, this is when it becomes really noticeable if you made the right decision about what you wanted to go for, because this is the point where you have those arguments that you made that you wanted to keep through the entire round, and you can see whether or not it's actually enough at this point. And if you have thought ahead this far and you knew what arguments you wanted in the 2AR, then what you've said should be enough for you to make all of the arguments that you want to make in the 2AR. And off that, for you to be able to win the round. Um, and I'd say the main strategy for the 2AR comes from the earlier speeches. Most of it, by the time you get to the actual speech, it's going to be done for you. And at this point, it's just about condensing arguments even more. No disadvantage in the 2AR should have more than one answer. It should just be one really good answer. And that doesn't mean that the answer can't have multiple parts or multiple warrants. The answer could have 12 warrants, and that would be fine. What I'm saying is you shouldn't be going for both the internal link and the impact. You should choose one argument and go for it. And that's going to be how you get the best 2AR possible and your best chances of winning the round. So the 2AR strategy should basically be answer everything on the advantage. Spend most of your time on the advantage. Spend as little time as you need on every neg argument. Prioritize it advantage, counterplans, disadvantage. And what you should be doing is making one really, really good argument on the neg or on the neg arguments. The counterplans, the disads, they should have one good argument, and that should be all you need to take them out, while you also have your own advantage, which is the reason why you win the round. And if you do that, if you make sure that you have as much as you can on your own arguments and you make them sound as good as possible, then that's going to be the best chance you have of winning the round. Because at the end of the day, you don't win the round by convincing the judge that the politics disad is wrong. You win the round by convincing them that your AF is right. And so in flow and lay rounds, that just comes from prioritizing your own arguments and prioritizing your AF. So while not all of this is true in a lay round, um, specifically, you should probably spend a bit more time on like the opposing team's arguments. The end of the day idea that you should be prioritizing your own arguments is still true, because you're not trying to convince them that the neg arguments are wrong. You're just trying to convince them that your plan is a good idea. Um, and so if you look ahead to the 2AR and see what you want to go for the most, and you see like what you value as the most important arguments in the round, then you should be well prepped to make those decisions starting at the 1AC and the 2AC and carry on those arguments throughout the round, making the decision of what arguments matter the most and then going for those arguments, and that should be all you really need. And I think most of this is probably true for neg 2, although there's some, yeah, I'll let Grace get into it, but basically there are some like different decisions you have to make, but the general idea stays true. And I think that's it for AF.
All right, cool. Thanks, Ari. I'm gonna screen share real quick.
I have a question for Ari.
Go for it.
For AF, like, how should you prioritize T, like in term, like relative to the other negative arguments?
Um, I've heard different things, but either first or after advantages. I think first is generally fine because it's more important than advantages in the way that like if you lose T, you lose the round even more so than advantages. So I normally put T first.
Okay, cool.
And also an FYI, the topicality lecture will cover win conditions for T because T debates are like the Wild West, something completely different.
Yeah, okay. I'm gonna get into the Negron strategy. We're gonna go in a chronological order and we're gonna do this pretty quick. So first, the 1AC, you should determine the next strat with your partner and look for flaws in the case, especially on the solvency and advantages. I know that's like basically the whole case, but a lot of the times, even though the evidence in the 1AC should be really good, oftentimes it's not. And you can find a lot of concessions and arguments within the evidence. If you have time, I would read through that after you create a next strat. And this is an example of how I like to mark up cards when I'm going through like their affirmative. For example, this is a card about how like people who have suffered from addiction currently aren't treated well in the program, and I highlighted a portion that says that they currently like go through screening to determine whether they should go to treatment or not, and like the app doesn't address that, so I highlighted that portion of the card so I can bring it up in a later speech. For the 1NC, the order should be the off case first and then the case. You want to start with your off case to introduce your offense because that's how like you win the round. That's how you win the round, by proving that the affirmative is like net worse than the status quo. So you need that offense, whether it's a disadvantage, counterplaying disadvantage, multiple disadvantages, K, T, whatever. And then you want to go into case responses. Usually, this should be a mixture of analytics and evidence. I personally am a strong proponent of including analysis alongside pieces of evidence. It just makes your speech sound much more smooth and like you're talking like like you're convincing someone rather than just talking at someone. So I would highly recommend using analytics. And even if you don't have analytics, an overview is also all right. Just like something to make it so you're not just like reading evidence for 8 minutes. Yeah. 2AC, you should really use this time to determine the neg block split. The 2NC and the 1 and R should be covering different contentions. I have some examples of neg block splits below. So for example, the 2NC can be the case and a disadvantage, and the 1 and R can be a disadvantage. So this year's topic, you could have the case and a generic politics disadvantage, and the 1 and R could be a specific disadvantage. Like I would love, specific disadvantages are rare, but if that does happen, that's how you should split the block. You could also do the 2NC takes the case and a counter plan, and the 1 and R takes the disadvantage. 2NC can take the case, 1 and R can take the disadvantage. 2NC can take the T, and maybe if there's a disad, the disad, or just T, the 1 and R can take case. The 2NC can take the K, and the 1 and R can take the case. Just like the neg block is 13 minutes of speech time. It's 13 minutes of unique negative speech time, and you should be filling all that 13 minutes with unique content and arguments. And it's a great time to just explain your arguments, pack on those warrants, and really pressure the 1AR. During the neg block, you should also have an idea of what you want your 2 and R to be. So if we go back to the different neg block splits, if you want your 2 and R strategy to be the case and the generic politics disad, you should focus more on that in your neg block and throughout the rest of the affirmative speech, like the 1AR, just so that you know how to respond and how to pivot that speech so that it gives you the best ability to win that contention in your 2 and R. You want to have multiple responses on each AF response, similar to what Ari said about responding to every single warrant that the negative team has. You want to be able to have multiple responses to each affirmative response, just because it makes the 1AR's life so much harder, especially if you provide multiple good, unique responses and warrants to every single affirmative response to your off case and to your case arguments. On off case, new links and the disadvantage in Ks are always great. And you also want to make sure, I don't have this on this document, but you also want to extend what you arguments you made previously, and you want to add a layer of explanation, a second layer of explanation to those extensions, because oftentimes 1ARs will miss that. Impact calc is also really important in the neg block, just because you have so much time to really extrapolate why your impacts matter more than theirs, and why the judge should be evaluating your off case and your impacts heavier than the case impacts. This is also a great time for turns, especially impact turns or case turns. Obviously, make sure you don't double turn yourself, and make sure that your turns make sense. But this is a great time to put offense on most flows and make, again, the 1AR's life just super miserable. And finally, this kind of goes back to impact calc, but you want to elaborate on the why of the round, starting in the 2NC and the neg block in general, just kind of getting to the point of why you are winning the round, which is usually that the affirmative plan causes XYZ negative impact. On case, pick their evidence and try to incorporate it into your previous arguments, or you can use it to create new arguments and try to answer. I would try to put at least one response on every part of the advantage, just to really pressure the 1AR, but also target a specific part of the advantage that caters to your ideal 2 and R. For example, if you're let's say you're going for a disadvantage, and one specific piece of evidence on the link really links heavy into the disadvantage, then you want to hammer on that just so your 2 and R can easily make that connection and it's fresh in the judge's mind. In my opinion, the neg block should stray away from overuse of evidence. I think 13 minutes is a great way to show the judge that you actually know what you're talking about and that you have a deep understanding of the evidence you're reading. So bringing up quotes or lines or words from evidence you've already read, and then furthering arguments and making claims from those pieces of evidence is always a good look. And oftentimes the pieces of evidence we read are pretty lengthy. They're really packed with information. So if you're able to dissect them, whether that's before or even during your round, and make arguments from that, it looks good. And this is an example of like a little piece of a document, just like a Words document that I used during one of our 2NCs in a tournament, the last tournament. So you can see I have like specific things. I pulled quotes from their pieces of evidence. I pulled like examples from their evidence. I kind of like related that to the counter plan, and then on solvency, I kind of wrote out like 4 specific responses that the 1AR would have to respond accordingly to like all of them, or else I could bring them up and use them in my next speech. All right. 1AR, just really use this time to finalize 1NR strategy. If they really fumble the bag on something, make sure to capitalize on that. Like, you want to be listening during the 1AR, even if you are also actively preparing your 2NR. Okay, 2NR. This speech should tell the story of why you win. Write a thesis if that helps. That's usually what I do. It's like the counter plan means that we win this round because XYZ. There should be one main piece of off case that you believe will win you the round. Kick the other stuff. Stereotypically, it's like DA, CPDA, KT. CPDA, you have to have a disadvantage with your counter plan unless it's like textually competitive, or else there's like no reason why you cannot do the counter plan and the affirmative plan. You have to have some type of like net benefit. K or T. If you're going for T, the 5 minutes should like just be T and show why T wins you the round. If it's counterplan or disadvantage, you mention on case how the disadvantage like turns the case and how the counterplan's able to solve the case impacts better, but also avoiding the disadvantage impacts. Ultimately, like this thesis should shape every single contention and how you respond in this round and in this speech. Consolidation throughout the round is so important because of the structure of a 2NR. It's only going to be covering like you're only going to be using like these 1 or 2 off case. So you really want to make sure you don't just suddenly kick. You don't want to make sure that you're extending like every single piece of off case you read throughout the round until a 2NR, and then just like drop everything. That like, this also means you can't go for like every single argument on your off case or on your on case. You need to pick the arguments that you're winning and the ones that are going to help you like close doors. And what I mean by that is like the ones that are going to help you preempt like common or obvious AF answers, and like you can respond to those in the 2NR. Just like even if the AF says XYZ happens, it doesn't matter because XYZ happens. So if you look back here, like instead of extending all 4 into the 2NR, I would choose 1 or 2 that really help to A, hammer home my thesis, and B, also helps shut the door on common affirmative arguments that someone might make. Okay, finally, some general tips. Remember that your burden is to prove if the affirmative was worse than the status quo. You don't have to do more than that unless you bring up counterplan. In that case, you have to prove that the counterplan is better and mutually exclusive than the AF as well. Secondly, use prep. So many teams don't use their full prep time, which is just so to their disadvantage. You have 8 minutes this year, definitely use all of it. On that note, do not prep before the 1NR because you literally have like 13 minutes of built-in prep during the round with all the cross X's and other teams' prep time to write that speech already. And finally, communicate with your partner. If you aren't comfortable with a certain argument, tell your partner that. Chances are you'll be able to debate an argument or a strategy that you understand and are comfortable with than like an unfamiliar argument that you don't really want to be reading. I know this was kind of fast. If you want this document and if you want these notes, I can share them with you. Just let me know. But this is the general gist of like negative round strategy. Biggest takeaways are just like consolidate, strategize, and make sure that you have like a key piece of offense. Any questions?
For the block, I would ask like this is kind of like a friendly question. Like, why is it advantageous to split the block?
Yeah. The answer is that you like I kind of covered this with like the first. It's 13 minutes of unique speech time. If you just like if the 2NC covers every single contention and then the 1NR covers every single contention, you're just repeating yourself. That's so ineffective and really what's the right word? Hinders your ability to create to add in more content, to have more warrants, to have more arguments, to read another piece of evidence. It's just strategic to split the block. Anything else?
I'm sorry, what did you mean by on, like, what does it mean by on case and off case?
Yeah. So on case would be like the affirmative case, so inherency, solvency, and the two advantages. What the affirmative team reads in the 1AC. Off case would be what the 1AC reads, so that's disadvantages, counterplans, topicality, and other like arguments like that. Anything else?
Could this document get posted in the classroom?
So this isn't like Google Docs or anything. I need to figure out how to like export this, but once I do, I can yeah.
Thank you.
Mhm.
All right, I'm gonna say goodbye to all of y'all in the future and end the recording.